The wind didn't howl against the 62nd floor of Harrington Global, it screamed. Daniel Hayes paused in the marble hallway, toolbox in hand, listening to the storm tear at the reinforced glass like it had a personal grudge against anyone foolish enough to work this late on a Thursday night in December. He'd been fixing a temperamental thermostat in the executive conference room when the building's heating system decided to throw one of its periodic tantrums. Nothing dramatic. Just the kind of problem that made rich people uncomfortable enough to call maintenance at 9:30 at night, as if cold air cared about their meeting schedules. Daniel didn't mind. The overtime helped, and Emma was safe at Mrs. Chen's downstairs, probably asleep with her sketchbook still open on some half-finished drawing of the city skyline. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His daughter had inherited her mother's eye for seeing beauty in concrete and steel, though she'd never known Sarah long enough to remember that. He was heading toward the service elevator when he noticed the light. The executive lounge sat at the corner of the building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that real estate agents probably described as breathtaking and once in a lifetime. Tonight, those same windows framed a wall of swirling snow that looked less like winter wonderland and more like nature having a breakdown. But there was still light inside, not the harsh fluorescence of the offices, but something softer, warmer. Daniel stopped. His shift had officially ended 20 minutes ago, but something about that light felt wrong. Not dangerous wrong, just alone wrong. He pushed open the glass door, the warmth of the lounge hitting him like a gentle rebuke to the storm outside. Leather armchairs arranged around low tables, a small bar area with crystal glasses that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Abstract art that looked expensive because it was supposed to look expensive. And there, in the far corner, a figure hunched in one of the chairs like she was trying to disappear into the expensive upholstery. "Ma'am?" Daniel's voice came out softer than he'd intended. "Building's supposed to be cleared by now." The woman's head snapped up, and even in the dim light he could see the quick swipe of her hand across her cheek. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a style that probably had a name rich people knew. Her coat was the kind of navy blue that screamed money without saying a word. Perfectly tailored, perfectly pressed. Everything about her was perfect, actually. Except for the way she was sitting like someone had hollowed her out with a spoon. "I'm not crying," she said, her voice cracking like frost underfoot. "The heater's broken, that's all." Daniel set down his toolbox slowly. The heater was working fine. He'd checked it 15 minutes ago. But he'd learned a long time ago that people said a lot of things when they were trying not to fall apart, and most of those things weren't meant to be taken literally. "I can take a look at it," he offered, not moving closer, "if you want." She stared at him for a moment, her eyes the kind of pale blue that belonged in winter sky, not corporate lounges. There was something familiar about her face, though he couldn't place it. Maybe he'd seen her picture in the company newsletter, smiling at some charity event or ribbon cutting. "Your maintenance," she said, not a question. "Daniel Hayes," he said, "and yes, Isla." She didn't offer a last name, but then again, she probably didn't need to. This was the executive floor. The only people who belonged up here after hours were the ones who owned pieces of the building, or the ones who fixed things for the people who owned pieces of the building. Daniel noticed the postcard then. It was sitting on the small table next to her chair, half hidden under a coffee cup that looked like it had been cold for hours. The writing on it was careful, deliberate, in that concentrated way kids wrote when they were trying their best. The kind of handwriting that came with tongue poking out the corner of the mouth and fingers gripping the pen like it might try to escape. "Writing to someone?" he asked, nodding toward the card. Isla's hand moved to cover it, quick as a reflex. "I write for someone else," she said. "Someone who needs to hear from people who can't write back." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning Daniel wasn't supposed to understand but somehow did. He'd written his own letters to ghosts, back when Emma still asked why Mommy never came home from work. Different ghosts, maybe, but the same desperate need to keep something alive that should have died with the person who left. "That's kind," he said. "It's complicated." She tucked the postcard fully under the cup, like hiding it might make the complication disappear. "You said you could look at the heater?" Daniel nodded, though they both knew the heater wasn't the problem. He walked over to the unit, checking connections that didn't need checking, adjusting settings that were already perfectly adjusted. The whole time, he was aware of her watching him, not in the way rich people usually watched maintenance staff, like they were furniture that happened to move, but like she was trying to figure out if he was safe. "You should be working better now," he said when he'd run out of things to pretend to fix. "Thank you." Her voice was steadier now, but still fragile around the edges. "I should go. It's late." She stood, gathering her purse and the postcard with movements that were too controlled, too careful, like someone walking on ice who knew exactly how thin it was. Daniel watched her move toward the door, noted the way she held herself, like she was carrying something heavy that no one else could see. At the threshold, she paused. "The storm's supposed to get worse," she said without turning around. "Weather service says it should pass by morning," Daniel replied. "Right." She stepped into the hallway, her heels clicking against marble until the sound disappeared into the building's white noise of climate control and distant elevators. Daniel packed up his tools slowly, but he couldn't shake the image of her sitting in that chair, writing careful words to someone who couldn't write back. The postcard had been addressed to Mom in that same careful handwriting, and Isla had been writing for someone who needed to hear from people who can't write back. The storm threw itself against the windows with renewed fury, but Daniel barely heard it. He was thinking about ghosts, and the letters people wrote to keep them alive, and the way Isla had looked when she thought no one was watching, like she was the only person left in the world who knew how to write to the dead. Outside, the city disappeared behind curtains of snow, and somewhere in the building below, a young woman with winter sky eyes was probably still carrying that postcard, still carrying whatever complicated thing had brought her to the executive lounge to cry over broken heaters that weren't actually broken. Daniel turned off the lights and headed for the elevator, but the image followed him down 61 floors. Isla Harrington, because that's who she had to be, up on the executive floor after hours, sitting alone with a child's careful handwriting, writing letters to someone who couldn't write back. The storm could rage all it wanted. Some things were harder to weather than winter. The elevator on the 43rd floor had been acting up for 3 days running, making a grinding noise that sounded like someone dragging chains across concrete. Daniel had already replaced the motor brushes twice and realigned the guide rails, but the damn thing kept catching between floors like it was personally offended by the concept of smooth operation. "You're haunting the top floors again," Miguel Alvarez called from the security desk as Daniel wheeled his diagnostic equipment past the marble and brass lobby. "Second time this week you've been up there past 9. Miguel had been working nights at Harrington Global for 6 years, ever since he'd retired from the NYPD with a commendation and a pension that didn't quite stretch far enough. He was the kind of man who noticed everything and forgot nothing, which made him either the best security guard in Manhattan or the most dangerous, depending on what you were trying to hide. "Elevators don't keep business hours," Daniel said, though they both knew he could have fixed this particular problem during his regular shift if he'd wanted to. "Uh-huh." Miguel's grin was visible even from across the lobby. "And I suppose it's just coincidence that Miss Harrington's been working late every night this week, too." Daniel paused at the elevator bank, finger hovering over the call button. "Ms. Harrington?" "CEO's daughter, Isla. Pretty girl. Looks like she carries the weight of the world in her purse." Miguel leaned back in his chair, hands folded behind his head. "Word is she practically runs the old man's schedule. Handles all the stuff he's too important to handle himself. Family tragedy a few years back. Mother died in some accident. Now it's just her, the old man, and a younger brother." The elevator dinged open, but Daniel didn't step inside. "She ever talk to staff?" "Polite as Sunday morning, but that's about it. Good evening, Miguel. Have a good night, Miguel. Never stops to chat, never asks how the family's doing." "Not mean, just—" Miguel searched for the word. "Contained. Like she's got everything locked down so tight she's afraid something might escape if she breathes too hard." Daniel finally stepped into the elevator but kept his foot in the door. "That why you're warning me off?" "I'm not warning you off anything," Miguel said. "I'm just saying people like her have their own world, and it's not ours. Different problems, different solutions. Sometimes trying to fix something that's not meant for you just breaks it worse." The elevator tried to close, bumped against Daniel's boot, tried again, like it was getting impatient with the conversation. "Maybe," Daniel said, "or maybe some things are broken the same way no matter how much money you have. Miguel's expression softened. "You still thinking about Sarah?" Daniel pulled his foot back and let the doors close without answering. Miguel was a good friend, but some conversations belonged in the silence between elevator floors, not in marble lobbies where every word echoed like a confession. The 43rd floor was empty except for the emergency lighting and the hum of after-hours climate control. Daniel set up his equipment methodically, running diagnostics on the elevator's control system, while his mind wandered to executive lounges and postcards addressed to dead mothers. He'd been carrying the image of Isla for 3 days now, the way she'd sat in that chair like she was trying to disappear, the careful way she'd hidden that postcard like it contained state secrets. The elevator motor groaned to life, ran smooth for 30 seconds, then caught again with that grinding noise that meant something was still misaligned. Daniel was elbow-deep in the control panel when he heard the footsteps. Heels on marble, moving fast but trying to sound controlled. The kind of walk that belonged to someone who was late for something but couldn't afford to look like they were running. Isla appeared around the corner, still in that perfect navy coat, still carrying herself like she was balanced on the edge of something precarious. When she saw Daniel, she stopped short. "Oh, I didn't realize anyone was," she gestured vaguely at his equipment spread across the hallway. "Is it safe to use?" "Give me 5 more minutes," Daniel said, not looking up from the wiring. "Just realigning the sensor array." She nodded and stepped back, but didn't leave. Daniel could feel her watching him work, not impatiently, but like she was genuinely curious about how elevators functioned when they weren't trying to trap people between floors. "Long day?" he asked without looking up. "Aren't they all?" Her voice had that same controlled quality from the lounge, but with less fragility around the edges. Like she'd spent the last few days rebuilding whatever had cracked that night. Daniel tightened a connection, and the grinding noise stopped. The elevator motor hummed contentedly, like it had just been waiting for someone to pay attention to what it needed. "There we go," he said, standing and dusting off his hands. "Should run smooth now." "You always fix things this late?" Isla asked, and there was something almost like humor in her voice. "Almost." Daniel allowed himself a small smile. "Only when they break at the worst possible time." That earned him something that wasn't quite a laugh, but wasn't silence either. The sound someone made when they'd forgotten how to find things funny but still remembered that some things were supposed to be. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Isla stepped inside. Daniel gathered his tools quickly and followed, pressing the button for the ground floor. They rode down in silence for the first 30 floors, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was the silence of 2 people who understood that sometimes words were just noise, and sometimes the absence of noise said more than conversation ever could. "You know what's funny?" Isla said as they passed the 20th floor. "What's that?" "Things always seem to break at exactly the moment when you most need them to work." She was looking at her reflection in the polished steel doors, but Daniel got the impression she was seeing something else entirely. Like the universe has a sense of timing. Or maybe we just notice it more when we're already stretched thin, Daniel said. When everything's working fine, a broken elevator is just an inconvenience. When you're barely holding it together, it feels personal. The elevator slowed as they approached the lobby, and Isla turned to look at him directly for the first time since she'd stepped on. Her eyes were that same winter sky blue, but clearer now, like the storm had passed and left something sharper in its wake. "That's very philosophical for a maintenance supervisor," she said. "I read a lot of repair manuals," Daniel replied. "They're surprisingly deep." This time she did laugh, just a small sound, but real. Then the elevator opened, and she stepped out into Miguel's domain, clutching her purse against her side like it might try to escape if she wasn't careful. "Have a good evening, Miguel," she said as she passed the security desk. "You too, Miss Harrington," Miguel replied, but his eyes were on Daniel, one eyebrow raised in a question that Daniel pretended not to see. Daniel watched through the lobby windows as Isla walked out into the snow, her coat collar turned up against the wind. She moved like someone who was used to walking alone, but tonight there was something different about it. Less like armor, more like choice. "Elevator working better now?" Miguel asked when Daniel finally approached the security desk to sign out. "Yeah," Daniel said, scribbling his signature on the log sheet. "Just needed someone to pay attention to what it was trying to say." Miguel nodded slowly. "Funny how that works." Outside, the snow was falling steadier now, turning the city into something soft and muffled. Daniel could see Isla's footprints leading away from the building, already being filled in by fresh powder. By morning, they'd be gone completely, like she'd never been there at all. But Daniel would remember the way she'd laughed when he'd mentioned repair manuals, and the way she'd said things break at the worst possible time, like she was speaking from experience that went deeper than malfunctioning elevators. Some things, he thought as he headed home through the snow, were harder to fix than mechanical problems. But maybe, sometimes, they just needed someone to pay attention to what they were trying to say. The break room on the 58th floor wasn't supposed to be used after 8 p.m., but Daniel had learned that rules about spaces were more like suggestions when you were the person who kept those spaces functional. He needed coffee, real coffee, not the brown water from the vending machines, and the executive break room had one of those expensive machines that ground beans and made sounds like it was personally offended by instant coffee. It was past 10 on a Tuesday, and Daniel was running on 4 hours of sleep because Emma had woken up with nightmares again. She'd been having them more often lately, dreams about tall buildings and people who disappeared, and Daniel knew exactly where those images came from even if she didn't. 9 years old, and she was already carrying ghosts she couldn't name. The coffee machine was making its complicated whirring sounds when Daniel heard the soft scritch of pen on paper coming from one of the small tables near the windows. He turned, expecting to see a late working executive catching up on correspondence, and found Isla instead. She was bent over a stack of postcards, writing with the kind of focused concentration that meant she was trying very hard not to think about what she was doing. Her coat was draped over the back of her chair, and without its formal lines, she looked younger. More fragile, like someone who'd been staying up too late for too long. Daniel hesitated. The coffee machine beeped, signaling that his drink was ready, but he didn't move to collect it. Isla hadn't noticed him yet. She was completely absorbed in whatever she was writing, her hand moving in careful, deliberate strokes across the postcard. "I didn't know anyone else used this room after hours," Daniel said quietly, not wanting to startle her. Isla's pen stopped moving, but she didn't look up immediately. When she did, there was no attempt to hide what she was doing. The postcards were spread across the table like a paper archipelago, some already filled with writing, others blank and waiting. "I needed somewhere with good light," she said, "and privacy." Daniel collected his coffee and gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "Mind if I sit?" "I promise not to ask what you're writing." Something shifted in Isla's expression. Surprise, maybe, or relief. "You can ask," she said. "I'm just not sure I'll have a good answer." Daniel sat down and took a sip of his coffee. It was perfect, of course. Everything in this building was perfect, except for the people who worked in it. "They're for my brother," Isla said after a moment. "Ethan, he's 8. She picked up one of the finished postcards, and Daniel could see the careful handwriting that belonged to someone trying very hard to sound cheerful. The postcard showed a picture of Paris at sunset, the Eiffel Tower lit up like a golden needle against a pink sky. "I tell him about places our mother is visiting," Isla continued, her voice steady but soft. "Museums in Paris, beaches in Hawaii, little cafes in Italy where the coffee is better than anything you can get in New York." She set the postcard down carefully, aligning it with the others. "I mail them from different places, use different return addresses. Sometimes I get friends to help, send them from their business trips." Daniel nodded slowly. "How long has she been visiting these places?" 2 years. Isla's hand moved to another postcard, this one showing a mountain lake so blue it looked artificial. 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days. The numbers were too precise to be casual. They were the kind of numbers someone counted when they were trying to measure the distance between truth and kindness, between protection and deception. "He still believes she's coming back," Isla said, "and I'm not ready to take that away from him." Daniel set down his coffee cup. "I used to write letters to my daughter after her mother died. Not from her mother. I never pretended they came from Sarah. But I'd write to Emma these long letters about her mother, trying to keep Sarah alive in words since I couldn't keep her alive anywhere else." Isla looked up sharply. "Did it help?" "For a while, until Emma was old enough to ask why I was writing to her instead of talking to her." Daniel smiled ruefully. "Turns out kids are smarter than we give them credit for. They know the difference between stories and truth, even when we think we're being clever." But she was 5 when Sarah died, Isla asked. At least Emma remembers her. Ethan was barely 6 when Mom, she trailed off, then shook her head. I can't even say it. 2 years and I still can't say the words. You don't have to, Daniel said. Not to me, not to anyone. They sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by postcards from places neither of their ghosts had ever visited. Outside the windows, New York spread out like a circuit board, all lights and connections and invisible currents of electricity keeping everything running. The postcards, Daniel said finally, do they make you feel better or worse? Isla considered the question, her fingers tracing the edge of the Paris postcard. Both, she said. Writing them feels like I'm doing something good, something protective. But sending them feels like I'm lying to the most important person in my life. Maybe you're protecting him from something he's not ready for, Daniel said. Or maybe you're protecting yourself from something you're not ready for. Is there a difference? Daniel thought about Emma's nightmares, about the way she drew tall buildings with people falling from them, about the questions she asked that he couldn't answer without breaking something inside both of them. I don't know, he said honestly. I think sometimes we protect people from the truth because we need to believe that protection is possible, that we can control how much pain reaches the people we love. Isla picked up her pen again, then set it down without writing anything. My father thinks I should tell Ethan the truth. Says it's healthier, more honest. But my father shows his love by providing for people, not by being there for them. He doesn't understand that sometimes honesty is just another word for giving up. What do you think Ethan would want if he knew he had a choice? I think he'd want his mother back, Isla said. And since I can't give him that, I give him postcards from Paris. Daniel nodded. It wasn't the answer he'd expected, but it was honest in a way that made his chest tight with recognition. He'd done the same thing, in his own way. Written letters instead of having conversations, fixed broken things instead of addressing broken hearts. For what it's worth, Daniel said, I think you're braver than you know. Writing those postcards takes more courage than telling the truth. Because every time you write one, you have to live with knowing it's not real, but you do it anyway because someone else needs it to be real. Isla's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. Does it ever stop hurting? She asked. Missing them? No, Daniel said, but you learn to carry it differently. Like a weight that becomes part of your balance, instead of something that's always threatening to knock you over. She nodded and reached for another blank postcard, this one showing a street market in Morocco, all bright colors and shadowed alcoves. This one's going to be about spices, she said, all the different smells, and how the vendors know exactly which spices will make you think of home. Daniel finished his coffee while she wrote, watching her careful handwriting transform blank space into false hope that felt more real than most true things. When she was done, she looked up at him with something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't sadness either. Thank you, she said, for not telling me I should stop. Everyone deserves to grieve in their own way, Daniel said, even if it looks like postcards from places your mother never visited. Isla gathered the postcards into a neat stack, sliding them into her purse with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. But when she stood to leave, she paused at the door. The letters you wrote to Emma, she said, do you still have them? Every one. Good, she said. Someday she might want to know how much her mother meant to you, even after she was gone. Especially after she was gone. Then she left, taking her postcards and her careful grief with her, leaving Daniel alone in the break room with his perfect coffee and the lingering scent of her perfume. Outside the windows, the city hummed with invisible currents, and somewhere in that maze of light and steel, a little boy was waiting for mail from a mother who would never send it. Daniel stayed in the break room for another 20 minutes, not because he needed more coffee, but because he needed to sit with the recognition that some kinds of love were too complicated for truth, and some kinds of truth were too sharp for love. When he finally went home, he found Emma asleep at the kitchen table, her head pillowed on an unfinished drawing of a tall building with angels standing on the roof. He carried her to bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered the words Sarah used to say, "Sweet dreams, baby girl, someone's always watching over you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. It wasn't a postcard from Paris, but it was true enough to build dreams on. Daniel's apartment wasn't much to look at. A one-bedroom in Queens with thin walls and a radiator that clanged like it was personally offended by the concept of heat. But it was theirs, his and Emma's, and that made it home in ways that bigger places with better heating never could be. Emma was asleep on the couch, curled up under the blanket Sarah's mother had knitted before everything went sideways. She'd been drawing again. The coffee table was covered with her sketches of buildings and angels and people with wings. It was almost midnight, but Daniel couldn't sleep. Hadn't been able to since Tuesday night in the break room, since Isla had asked if missing people ever stopped hurting. He made coffee that didn't taste like the expensive machine at Harrington Global and settled into the chair by the window, pulling out the leather notebook he kept hidden behind Emma's school books. It wasn't much, just a cheap journal from the drugstore, but it held everything he couldn't say out loud. The newspaper clipping was on the 3rd page, yellowed now and soft around the edges from handling. "Apartment fire claims 1, injures several," read the headline, followed by a photograph of flames reaching out of broken windows like hungry fingers. Below that, a smaller story. "Off-duty firefighter rescues mother, child from burning building." Daniel remembered that night in ways that made his hands shake. The call had come in at 2:47 a.m. He could still see the red numbers on his alarm clock when his captain called to say they needed every available man. Structure fire on the Upper East Side. Possible casualties. All hands on deck. He'd been off shift, but Sarah was working a double at the hospital and wouldn't be home until morning. Emma was 3 then, sleeping in the crib they hadn't had the heart to replace with a big girl bed because she looked so small and safe behind those wooden bars. The building had been one of those old pre-war structures with narrow hallways and stairs that seemed designed to trap smoke and funnel it upward like a chimney. By the time Daniel got there, the fire had taken the 3rd and 4th floors, and people were hanging out of windows, screaming for help that seemed impossibly far away. He'd gone in through the back stairwell while the other crews worked the front. Smoke so thick he couldn't see his own hands, heat that turned the air into something solid and malicious. He'd found them on the 6th floor, a woman and a little girl, maybe 5 years old, huddled in a bathroom that had become their temporary refuge. The woman had been unconscious, overcome by smoke inhalation, but the little girl had been awake, her eyes wide and bright in the reflected light from his helmet lamp. She hadn't been crying. That's what he remembered most clearly. She should have been terrified, should have been screaming like every other child he'd carried out of burning buildings. But she'd been calm, watching him with those pale blue eyes like she'd been waiting for him specifically. "Are you an angel?" she'd asked when he picked her up. "Just a firefighter," he'd said. "Same thing," she'd replied with the kind of certainty that only children possessed. He'd carried them both down 6 flights of stairs through smoke that wanted to kill them all, the woman over his shoulder and the little girl in his arms, her small hands clutching the front of his jacket. When they'd reached the street, paramedics had taken the woman, alive, breathing, going to be fine, and Daniel had set the little girl down on the sidewalk. She'd looked up at him with those winter sky eyes and said, "Thank you for saving us." Then she'd pulled a crayon from her coat pocket. Who carries crayons to a fire? And drawn something on the back of a paramedic's clipboard. When she was done, she'd torn off the paper and handed it to him. It was a picture of a man with wings standing on top of a tall building. Underneath, in careful 5-year-old handwriting, she'd written, "Angel Daniel." Daniel had kept that drawing for 11 years. It was tucked into the notebook now, the crayon lines faded but still visible, still carrying the weight of that moment when a little girl had decided he was worth drawing. He'd never seen her again. The newspaper had identified the victims as Margaret Harrington and her daughter Isla, but Daniel had been dealing with his own crisis by then. Sarah's pregnancy complications, Emma's premature birth. The slow realization that being a firefighter and being a father required different kinds of courage. He'd left the force 6 months later, when Emma was still small enough to sleep on his chest, and Sarah was still there to tell him he was making the right choice. By the time the cancer took Sarah 3 years after that, the fire and the little girl with the crayons had become just another memory, filed away with all the other people he'd carried to safety. But now, sitting in his quiet apartment with Emma's drawings scattered around him like fallen snow, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about Isla's eyes. The same pale blue that had watched him through smoke and flame, the same clarity that cut through chaos and saw things other people missed. The same eyes that had looked at him across a table covered with postcards and asked if missing people ever stopped hurting. "Dad?" Emma's voice was soft, sleepy. She'd woken up on the couch and was looking at him with the kind of concern that children developed when they'd learned too young that adults weren't invincible. "Right here, sweetheart." Daniel closed the notebook quickly, but not before Emma caught sight of the drawing. "What's that?" she asked, padding over to his chair in bare feet and pajamas covered with cartoon cats. "Just an old picture," Daniel said. "Someone drew it for me a long time ago." Emma climbed into his lap, fitting against him like she'd been designed for that exact space. She studied the drawing with the serious attention she brought to all art, whether it was her own sketches or the paintings they sometimes looked at in library books. "It looks like you," she said finally, "except with wings." "You think so?" "Yeah. And the building looks like where you work now." She traced the crayon lines with one finger. "The person who drew this must have really liked you." Daniel looked at the drawing again, seeing it through Emma's eyes. The building did look like Harrington Global, tall and imposing, reaching toward a sky that seemed infinite, and the angel did look like him if you were 5 years old and believed that firefighters and angels were the same thing. "I think she did," Daniel said quietly. "She?" Emma perked up with the kind of interest that meant questions were coming. "The little girl who drew it. I helped her and her mother get out of a building that was on fire. Like a superhero, like a firefighter doing his job." Emma considered this, her head heavy against his shoulder. "Do you think she remembers you?" Daniel thought about Isla sitting in the executive lounge, writing postcards to a dead mother for a little brother who needed to believe in impossible things. He thought about the way she'd looked at him in the break room, like she was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't even know she was working on. "I don't know," he said. "It was a long time ago, and she was very little." "I would remember," Emma said with the confidence of someone who believed memory was just another form of love. "If someone saved me from a fire, I would remember them forever." Daniel kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of children's shampoo and the lingering sweetness of the hot chocolate she'd had before bed. "Maybe she does remember," he said. "Maybe she just doesn't know it yet." Emma yawned and settled deeper into his lap. "Are you going to tell her?" "I don't know," Daniel said honestly. "Sometimes people need to figure things out for themselves." "Or sometimes they need someone to help them remember," Emma said, and then she was asleep again, her breathing deep and even against his chest. Daniel sat there for another hour, holding his daughter and looking at the drawing that had somehow traveled from a burning building to a corporate skyscraper, from a 5-year-old's grateful hands to a maintenance supervisor's hidden notebook. Outside, Queens settled into its late-night quiet, and somewhere across the city, Isla was probably writing another postcard from a place her mother had never been. The past had a way of circling back, Daniel thought. Sometimes it took 11 years and a chance encounter in an executive lounge, but eventually the things that mattered found their way home. He just wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with that knowledge, or whether Isla would want to know that the man who fixed her building's broken things was the same person who had once carried her through smoke and flame toward safety. Some rescues, he was learning, took more than one trip. Saturday maintenance calls were supposed to be emergencies only, burst pipes, failed heating systems, security malfunctions that couldn't wait until Monday. But Robert Harrington's definition of emergency apparently included a dripping faucet in the private conference suite that most people would have ignored until the next business day. Daniel didn't mind. Saturday overtime paid time and a half, and Emma could come with him to the mostly empty building, setting up her drawing supplies in whatever room he was working in while he fixed whatever needed fixing. It was better than leaving her with Mrs. Chen all weekend, and Emma loved the view from the upper floors. He'd expected the conference suite to be empty, who held meetings on Saturday morning, but when the elevator opened on the 55th floor, Daniel could hear voices coming from the direction of the executive conference room. Adult and child, the rhythm of conversation between someone trying to explain something and someone trying to understand. "Just set up in the hallway," Daniel told Emma quietly. "I'll only be a few minutes." But Emma had already spotted the source of the voices through the glass walls of the conference room, and her artist's eye had latched onto something that made her forget about her sketchbook entirely. "Dad, look," she whispered, pointing. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Daniel could see Isla sitting at the long mahogany table, papers spread in front of her like she was trying to organize the entire world into manageable categories. And across from her, a little boy with dark hair and serious eyes was bent over a drawing, his tongue poking out the corner of his mouth in concentration. Ethan had to be 8 years old, Isla had said, and this boy looked exactly like someone who still believed in postcards from Paris and mothers who were just visiting other countries. "He's drawing angels," Emma said, her voice filled with the kind of recognition that belonged to one artist spotting another. "Look at the wings." Daniel looked. Even from the hallway, he could see the careful way the boy was sketching. The deliberate strokes that came from someone who drew the same subject over and over until they got it exactly right. Angels with broad wings, standing on tall buildings, watching over a city that stretched to the horizon. "Maybe I should come back later," Daniel said, but Emma was already walking toward the conference room door. "Emma, wait." Too late. She pushed open the glass door and stepped inside with the kind of confidence that belonged to children who hadn't learned yet that some spaces weren't meant for them. "Hi," she said to Ethan, who looked up from his drawing with surprise. "I'm Emma. I draw too." Isla's head snapped up, her eyes moving from Emma to Daniel, who was still standing in the doorway with a toolbox in one hand and an expression that probably looked like panic. "I'm sorry," Daniel said quickly. "I didn't realize anyone was using the room. I can come back." "No, it's fine," Isla said, but her voice had that careful quality that meant she wasn't sure if it was fine or not. "We were just—" Ethan needed somewhere quiet to work on his art project. Emma had already moved to look over Ethan's shoulder, studying his drawing with the serious attention she brought to all artistic endeavors. "That's really good," she said. "The proportions are hard to get right, but you did it perfectly." Ethan beamed at the praise. "I've been practicing. Isla says if you want to get good at something, you have to do it every day." "Isla's right," Emma said, settling into the chair next to him without invitation. "My dad says the same thing about fixing stuff. He fixes something every day, so now he can fix almost anything." Daniel felt Isla's eyes on him, studying his face like she was trying to solve a problem she didn't fully understand. There was something different about her today. Less guarded, maybe, or just more tired. She was wearing jeans instead of her usual perfect work clothes, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that made her look younger. More like the little girl who had drawn angels on the back of a paramedic's clipboard. "What kind of angels do you draw?" Ethan asked Emma, apparently deciding that anyone who understood art was automatically a friend. "Different kinds," Emma said. "Sometimes they're on buildings, like yours. Sometimes they're in hospitals or schools or places where people need help." "Do you think they're real?" Ethan's question was asked with the kind of earnestness that meant the answer mattered. Emma considered this carefully. "I think people who help other people are real. And if that's what angels do, then yeah, they're real." Daniel felt something tight in his chest as he watched his daughter talk to this boy who drew the same subject she did, who asked the same questions about whether salvation was possible and help was real. Two children who had learned early that the world could be dangerous, and that sometimes the only thing standing between safety and catastrophe was someone willing to reach out their hand. "Your daughter?" Isla asked quietly, appearing at Daniel's elbow while the children compared techniques for drawing feathers. "Emma, she's 9. Daniel set down his toolbox. "I hope it's okay that she's here. Saturday childcare is—" "Complicated," Isla finished. "I know the feeling." They watched Emma show Ethan how to shade the wings of his angels, her hands moving with the kind of confidence that came from countless hours of practice. Ethan absorbed every instruction like he was learning secrets of the universe. "He doesn't usually warm up to people that quickly," Isla said. "Emma has a gift." "She's been drawing angels since she was old enough to hold a crayon," Daniel said. "I never knew why until recently." Something in his tone made Isla look at him more sharply, but before she could ask what he meant, Emma was calling him over. "Dad, look what Ethan drew," she said, holding up the boy's sketchbook. "It's like the one you have in your notebook." Daniel's breath caught. The drawing was almost identical to the one he'd been looking at 3 nights ago. An angel standing on a tall building, wings spread wide, watching over a city that stretched to the horizon. But this version was more detailed, more refined, the work of someone who had been perfecting the image for years. "That's my favorite," Ethan said proudly. "I've drawn it lots of times. Isla says it's from a story our mom used to tell me, about angels who live in tall buildings and make sure people don't get hurt." Daniel looked at Isla, saw the way her face had gone very still, very careful. She was watching him look at the drawing, and he could see the exact moment when something clicked into place behind her eyes. "Angels in tall buildings," Daniel repeated quietly. "It's just a story," Isla said quickly, "something to help him sleep when he was little." But Ethan was shaking his head. "It's not just a story. Mom said it really happened. She said an angel carried us out of a fire when I was too little to remember." The silence that followed was the kind that filled up with weight until someone had to break it, or risk being crushed. Emma looked between the adults, sensing undercurrents she couldn't name but knew were important. "A fire?" Daniel asked, his voice careful and quiet. "When I was really little," Ethan said, "Mom said we lived in a different building then, and there was a fire, and an angel came and carried us down all the stairs to where it was safe." Emma's eyes went wide. "Like a firefighter?" "Mom said he looked like a firefighter, but he was really an angel because firefighters don't usually have time to save people who aren't screaming for help." Ethan went back to his drawing, adding careful details to the angel's coat. "She said he was gentle and strong, and he smelled like smoke and winter air." Daniel felt the world shift slightly, like a building settling after an earthquake. Isla was staring at him now, her winter sky eyes wide with something that might have been recognition, or might have been hope, or might have been terror. "The angel," Daniel said slowly. "Did your mother ever mention his name?" Ethan nodded seriously. "She said I called him Angel Daniel because angels and firefighters are the same thing." The silence this time was absolute. Even the building's climate control seemed to pause, waiting to see what would happen next. "Dad?" Emma's voice was small, uncertain. "Is that the same Daniel from your drawing?" Before Daniel could answer, Isla stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Ethan, why don't you show Emma the supply room? There are better colored pencils there." Ethan looked between his sister and Daniel, sensing adult complications but not understanding them. "Did I say something wrong?" "No, sweetheart," Isla said, her voice gentle but strained. "You didn't say anything wrong. Just go with Emma for a few minutes, okay?" The children left, Emma casting worried glances back at her father, Ethan chattering about the differences between regular colored pencils and the expensive ones his father's company bought. When they were gone, Isla turned to face Daniel directly. "It was you," she said, not a question. "I think so," Daniel said. "Apartment fire, Upper East Side. You were 5. Your mother—" "Margaret," Isla whispered. "Her name was Margaret. She was unconscious when I found you, smoke inhalation. But you were awake, and you asked if I was an angel." Isla's hands were shaking now. "You said you were just a firefighter. And you said it was the same thing." She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were bright with tears she wasn't ready to shed. "I gave you a drawing. I still have it." "After 11 years?" "After 11 years." Isla sat back down heavily, like her legs had suddenly forgotten how to hold her weight. "I remember pieces. Smoke and sirens and someone carrying me. Strong arms and a voice that said everything was going to be okay. But I couldn't put it together." "You were 5 and traumatized," Daniel said gently. "Memory works differently when you're that age." "But Ethan remembers the story." "Because your mother told it to him, made it into something beautiful instead of something terrible." Isla laughed, but it came out broken. "She always did that. Made scary things into stories, bad things into adventures. Even after the fire, she never talked about what we lost, just about the angel who saved us." Daniel moved to the chair across from her, the same distance he'd maintained in the break room when she'd been writing postcards to ghosts. Close enough to offer comfort, far enough away to let her choose whether to accept it. "Tomorrow's Sunday, sweetheart, the building will be closed." "But Isla has keys, right? Because her dad owns it?" Emma had latched onto the idea of seeing Ethan again with the kind of enthusiasm she usually reserved for snow days and art supply store visits. Daniel wasn't sure if it was the novelty of meeting another child who shared her interests, or something deeper. The recognition of another kid who had learned early that the world could be dangerous and that angels, whether real or imagined, were worth drawing. "I don't think we should bother them on their day off," Daniel said, but even as he said it, he was thinking about Isla's face when she'd said goodbye. The way she'd hesitated at the elevator, like there was something she wanted to say but didn't have words for. "Okay," Emma said, but she set the drawing aside carefully, like she was saving it for something important. Daniel's phone buzzed with a text message. He expected it to be Miguel, who sometimes texted updates about the building's weekend security checks. Instead, it was a number he didn't recognize. "This is Isla. Got your number from the employee directory. Are you busy tonight?" Daniel stared at the message for a long moment. In the 3 weeks he'd known Isla Harrington, she'd never initiated contact outside of work-related issues. Their conversations had been chance encounters, accidental intimacies that happened in empty break rooms and elevators between floors. "Not particularly," he texted back. "Everything okay?" "Can't sleep. Keep thinking about what you said about memory and trauma. Would you like to get coffee? I know a place that's open late." Daniel looked at Emma, who was arranging her drawings into careful stacks and humming something that might have been a lullaby Sarah used to sing. She'd be fine for a few hours with Mrs. Chen, and the truth was, he couldn't sleep either. Hadn't been able to since this morning, since the moment Ethan had mentioned Angel Daniel, and Daniel had seen recognition dawn in Isla's eyes. "I'll pick you up," he texted. "Where are you?" "Harrington Global rooftop. I have access." Daniel blinked at the message. The rooftop of a 60-story building at 9 o'clock on a December night wasn't exactly where he'd expected to find anyone, let alone someone who spent most of her time in climate-controlled offices. "Be there in 30 minutes, he replied. An hour later, Daniel emerged from the rooftop access door into a winter night that felt more like entering a different world than climbing 60 floors above street level. The city spread out below them like a circuit board made of light, and the wind at this height carried sounds from everywhere and nowhere, the urban symphony reduced to a distant hum. Isla was standing at the north railing, her coat collar turned up against the wind, looking out over a view that probably cost more per month than Daniel made in a year. She'd been up here long enough for snow to collect on her shoulders, but she didn't seem to notice the cold. "You come up here often?" Daniel asked, joining her at the railing but keeping enough distance that she didn't feel crowded. "When I need to think," she said. "When the office feels too small and my apartment feels too quiet, and I need to remember that the world is bigger than whatever problem I'm trying to solve." Daniel looked out over the city, trying to see it through her eyes. From this height, the streets looked like geometry, the traffic like blood cells moving through arteries, the people invisible but somehow still present in the patterns of light and movement. "What are you thinking about tonight?" he asked. Isla was quiet for a long moment, her breath visible in small clouds that the wind caught and scattered. "I've been thinking about the difference between remembering and knowing," she said finally. "About how you can know something happened to you without really remembering it, and how sometimes remembering changes what you thought you knew." Daniel waited. He'd learned that Isla talked the way she did everything else. Carefully, deliberately, with each word chosen for maximum precision. "I knew there had been a fire," she continued. "I knew someone had saved us. I even knew there had been a firefighter who carried me down the stairs. But knowing it felt like reading about something that happened to someone else. The memory wasn't mine, it was just information." "And now? She died 2 years ago," Isla said suddenly. "Cancer. And I've been trying so hard to be what she was for Ethan, to make scary things beautiful and keep him safe from the truth. But I'm not her, and I don't know how to make angels out of grief." "Maybe you don't have to," Daniel said. "Maybe it's enough to just be there when the grief gets too heavy to carry alone." Isla looked at him with those pale blue eyes that had seen too much and held too much and still somehow managed to find room for hope. "You came back," she said. "After 11 years, you came back." "I didn't know I was coming back," Daniel said. "I just knew something was broken, and I fix things that are broken." "Even people?" "Especially people." Outside the conference room, they could hear Emma and Ethan's voices, the easy chatter of children who had found common ground in art and angels, and the belief that safety was possible if you just knew where to look for it. "What happens now?" Isla asked. Daniel didn't have an answer for that. But for the first time since Sarah died, he felt like maybe he didn't need to have all the answers. Maybe it was enough to just be there, in a conference room on a Saturday morning, with a woman who drew postcards to dead mothers and a memory that had been waiting 11 years to come full circle. "Now," he said, "I fix the dripping faucet, and then maybe we let the kids show us how to draw angels that look like they actually know what they're doing." For the first time since he'd known her, Isla Harrington smiled. Really smiled. Not the careful expression she wore for the world, but something bright and real and surprised by its own existence. "I'd like that," she said. And in the supply room down the hall, two children were making plans to draw the tallest building in the world, with angels on every floor, watching over a city that suddenly felt a little bit safer than it had that morning. The faucet had been a 10-minute fix, but Daniel had stretched it into an hour, partly because Ethan kept asking questions about how plumbing worked, and partly because leaving felt like abandoning something important just when it was beginning to take shape. By the time he'd packed up his tools, Emma and Ethan had filled 3 pages with collaborative angel drawings, and Isla had relaxed enough to offer actual coffee instead of the polite dismissal he'd been expecting. But when 5 o'clock came and the building's weekend security protocols kicked in, Miguel had appeared to remind them that even CEOs' daughters weren't supposed to be in the building after hours without proper authorization. "I should go," Daniel had said, gathering Emma's art supplies while she made Ethan promise to practice his shading techniques. "Me too," Isla had agreed, but she'd said it like someone agreeing that they should probably stop bleeding, not like someone who actually knew how to make it happen. That had been 3 hours ago. Daniel was home now, helping Emma organize her drawings into what she called her portfolio. But his mind kept wandering to the expression on Isla's face when she'd realized he was the firefighter from her childhood. Relief and confusion and something that looked almost like grief, as if remembering being saved had reminded her of everything she'd lost since then. "Dad, you're not paying attention," Emma said, holding up a drawing of the Harrington Global building with angels stationed at regular intervals along its height. "I said this one's for Ethan, but I need to know if you think I got the proportions right." Daniel looked at the drawing, really looked at it this time. Emma had captured something in the lines that he hadn't noticed before, a sense of protection rather than just observation. These weren't angels watching from a distance. They were angels standing guard. "It's perfect," he said, "but are you sure you want to give it away? You worked hard on this one." "That's why I want to give it to him," Emma said matter-of-factly. "He taught me how to do the wings better, so now I want to teach him something back. That's how friendship works." Daniel nodded, struck by his daughter's casual wisdom about reciprocity and kindness. At 9 years old, she understood things about human connection that some adults never figured out. "Can we take it to him tomorrow?" Emma asked. "I want to see if he likes it. Now I remember your voice, the way you held me like I was something precious instead of something damaged, the smell of your coat, smoke and winter air, just like Ethan said. I remember feeling safe for the first time in hours, maybe days." She turned to look at him directly, and in the reflected light from the city below, her eyes looked silver instead of blue. "I remember that you didn't just carry me to safety," she said. "You made me believe that safety was possible." Daniel felt something tight in his chest, the same feeling he'd had 11 years ago when a 5-year-old girl had looked at him and decided he was worth drawing. "You were very brave," he said, "braver than most adults would have been." "I was terrified," Isla said. "But you made me feel like being terrified was okay, like it didn't make me weak or wrong. You just stayed with me. Even when we got outside and the paramedics took over, you stayed until you were sure I was going to be all right. That's the job." "No," Isla said firmly, "the job was getting us out alive. Everything else was just you being kind to a scared little girl who needed someone to believe in angels." They stood in silence for a while, watching the city breathe beneath them. Daniel thought about the drawing in his notebook, about the careful way Ethan had recreated an image from a story his mother had told him, about the strange mathematics of memory and time that had brought them all back together in a conference room on a Saturday morning. "Can I ask you something?" Isla said. "Sure." "When you were a firefighter, did you ever think about the people you saved? I mean, later, when you weren't working, did you wonder what happened to them?" Daniel considered the question. "Sometimes. More often, I tried not to think about them. The job was about the moment, getting people out, making sure they were breathing, moving on to the next call. If you started thinking too much about what happened after, about whether you'd really saved them or just postponed something inevitable." He trailed off, but Isla nodded like she understood what he wasn't saying. "But you kept my drawing," she said. "I kept your drawing." "Why?" Daniel leaned against the railing, feeling the cold metal through his gloves. "Because you made me feel like what I was doing mattered. Not just the rescue. That was just mechanics, training, muscle memory. But you made me feel like being kind mattered. Like taking an extra minute to make sure you weren't scared. Like staying with you until you felt safe. Like all the small things that weren't technically part of the job were maybe the most important part. And then you stopped being a firefighter. And then I stopped being a firefighter. Isla was quiet for a moment. Do you miss it? I miss feeling like I was making a difference, Daniel said honestly. I miss the clarity of knowing exactly what needed to be done and having the tools to do it. But I don't miss the weight of carrying so many people's worst days. Is that why you became a maintenance supervisor? Because fixing buildings is simpler than fixing lives? Daniel smiled ruefully. I became a maintenance supervisor because I needed a job with regular hours and steady pay and health insurance for Emma. But yeah, there's something to be said for problems that stay fixed once you solve them. Except people aren't really that different from buildings, are they? Isla said. Sometimes what looks like a catastrophic failure is really just a system that needs attention, maintenance, someone who knows how to listen to what it's trying to say. Daniel looked at her, struck by the observation. Is that what you think I've been doing? Trying to fix you? I think you've been trying to understand me, Isla said, which might be the same thing or might be completely different. I'm not sure yet. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around them like confetti made of ice. Isla pulled her coat tighter, but she didn't suggest going inside. I've been thinking about the postcards, she said suddenly. About what you said about protecting Ethan from the truth versus protecting myself from having to say it out loud. And I think maybe you were right. Maybe I've been writing those postcards because I can't figure out how to tell an 8-year-old boy that his mother is never coming home, but also because as long as I keep writing them, I don't have to admit that she's never coming home to me either. Daniel turned to face her fully. There's no shame in that, Isla. Grief doesn't come with an instruction manual. But there has to be a point where protecting someone starts to hurt them instead of helping them, she said. A point where kindness becomes cruelty, even if you never meant it that way. Maybe. Or maybe there's a point where the person you're protecting becomes strong enough to carry the truth without being crushed by it. How do you know when that happens? Daniel thought about Emma, about the questions she'd started asking about her mother, about the way she'd begun drawing angels in hospitals and schools instead of just on tall buildings, about the slow shift from needing protection to needing honesty. I think they tell you, he said, not with words necessarily, but they start asking different questions, or they stop accepting easy answers, or they show you that they're ready to carry something heavier. Isla nodded slowly. Ethan asked me last week why Mom's letters never mentioned missing us. He said if he was away from us for 2 years, he'd miss us so much he'd write about it in every letter. What did you tell him? I told him that some people show love by focusing on happy things instead of sad things. But he looked at me like he knew I was lying. She laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. 8 years old, and he's already figured out that love means missing people, not pretending you don't. Kids are smarter than we think. Smarter than I wanted him to be, Isla said. I wanted to keep him little and safe and believing in impossible things for as long as possible. But maybe that's not what he needs anymore. What do you think he needs? Isla was quiet for a long time, looking out over the city that stretched to every horizon. I think he needs someone to tell him the truth and then stay with him while he figures out how to live with it. That sounds like something his big sister could do. Daniel's workshop in the basement of Harrington Global wasn't much to look at. Fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical resignation, concrete walls painted institutional beige, and the kind of ventilation system that moved air around without actually improving it. But it was his domain, the one place in the building where he didn't have to pretend that fixing things was simple. The workbench told the real story. Scattered across its scarred surface were dozens of items that employees had brought him over the years. A desk lamp with a frayed cord, a coffee maker that only worked when you hit it at exactly the right angle, a picture frame with a crack down the middle that someone couldn't bring themselves to throw away, things that were broken but not worthless, damaged but not beyond hope. He'd fixed them all, labeled them with masking tape, and stored them on metal shelving that reached to the ceiling, waiting for their owners to remember they'd left something behind. Most never came back for them. That's quite a collection, Isla said from the doorway. Daniel looked up from the circuit board he was testing. It was Tuesday afternoon, 3 days since their conversation on the rooftop, and she'd been different since then. More present, somehow, like she'd made a decision about something important and was still figuring out how to live with it. People throw away things that just need attention, he said, setting down his multimeter. Seems wasteful. Isla stepped into the workshop, her heels clicking against concrete until she stopped in front of the shelving unit. She ran her finger along the edge of a small radio, its antenna bent, but its case lovingly polished. "How long do you keep them?" "As long as it takes." "For what?" Daniel wiped his hands on a shop rag, considering the question. For someone to realize that what they threw away was worth coming back for. "And if they never come back, then I find someone else who needs what they left behind." Isla nodded, like this made perfect sense to her. She picked up a music box with a missing dancer, wound it carefully, and listened to the thin melody that played from its depths. The sound was fragile but clear, beautiful in its imperfection. "Is that why you stayed?" she asked, "after you could have gotten a better job somewhere else? Because you thought someone might come back for the things they'd left behind?" Daniel had been expecting this question, or something like it, since Saturday. Since the moment she'd realized who he was and started looking at him like he was a puzzle she needed to solve. "I stayed because fixing quiet things makes the silence bearable," he said. Isla set down the music box carefully. "What silence?" "The one that comes after the sirens stop. After the crisis is over and everyone goes home and you're left wondering if what you did actually mattered, or if you just postponed the inevitable." She leaned against the workbench, her expression thoughtful. "You mean after Sarah died?" Daniel nodded. "After Sarah died. After I left the fire department. After I realized that saving people didn't mean they stayed saved. I needed to do something that stayed fixed once I fixed it." "Except you don't just fix things," Isla said. "You restore them. You make them better than they were before." Daniel looked around his workshop, seeing it through her eyes. She was right. Most of the items on his shelves didn't just work. They worked better than they had when people had brought them to him. He'd upgraded circuits, reinforced weak joints, improved designs that had been flawed from the beginning. "Maybe I'm just stubborn," he said. "Maybe you're still saving people, just in a different way." There was something in her voice that made him look at her more carefully. She was staring at a section of the wall where he'd tacked up various drawings Emma had made over the years, pictures of buildings and bridges and people with tools, her visual interpretation of what her father did for work. But partially hidden behind a work order from last month was the corner of something else. Something drawn in faded crayon that had been there so long Daniel barely saw it anymore. Isla reached past the work order and pulled the drawing free. Angel Daniel. The same careful 5-year-old handwriting, the same figure with wings standing on a tall building. 11 years of being pinned to workshop walls and moved from apartment to apartment and carried in toolboxes, and somehow it had survived everything. "You really kept it," she said softly. "I told you I did." "I know, but seeing it here, in your workspace where you look at it every day." She traced the crayon lines with one finger. "It's like you've been carrying a piece of that night with you all this time." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, the same feeling he'd had on the rooftop when she'd remembered the smell of his coat and the sound of his voice. Like a weight he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "The night I pulled you out of that fire," he said slowly, "it was the last time I felt certain that what I was doing mattered. Not because it was the most dramatic rescue or the most dangerous situation, but because of what you said afterward. Because you made me believe that kindness and competence were the same thing. And then Sarah got sick. And I realized that all the training in the world couldn't save the person who mattered most to me. That sometimes being good at your job isn't enough." Isla was quiet for a moment, still holding the drawing. "So you kept the picture to remind you of the last time you felt useful?" "I kept the picture to remind me that sometimes being useful and being kind are the same thing. That fixing things, whether they're elevators or radios or scared little girls, isn't about being a hero. It's about paying attention to what needs attention." "Is that what you think you've been doing with me? Paying attention?" Daniel met her eyes directly. "I think I've been trying to understand why someone who has everything looks like someone who's lost everything." "And what have you figured out?" "That having everything doesn't mean anything if you're carrying it alone." Isla's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. "I've been alone for so long, I forgot what it felt like to have someone notice." "You're not alone anymore," Daniel said. "You have Ethan, and you have people who care about you, even if you don't always recognize it." "I have employees and business associates and people who need things from me," Isla said. "That's not the same as having someone who just stays." Daniel looked at the drawing in her hands, at the careful way she was holding it like it might dissolve if she gripped too tightly. What if it could be? What could be? What if someone stayed, not because they needed something from you, but because they wanted to? Because they recognized something in you worth staying for. Isla looked at him with those winter sky eyes that had seen too much and still somehow managed to hope. Are you talking about yourself? I'm talking about the possibility that some things are worth more than we think they are. That some people deserve more than they've learned to ask for. She handed him back the drawing, but her fingers lingered on his for a moment longer than necessary. I don't know how to ask for things I need, she said. I only know how to provide things other people need. Then maybe it's time to learn a different skill, Daniel said. Maybe it's time to let someone else do the fixing for a while. Outside the workshop, the building hummed with the quiet efficiency of people doing important work in important places. But down in the basement, surrounded by broken things waiting to be made whole, two people who had spent years learning to carry everything alone were beginning to understand that some weights were meant to be shared. They say, the power outage hit Harrington Global at 8:43 p.m. on a Thursday night, plunging 62 floors of Manhattan real estate into darkness that felt personal. Daniel was 3 floors up when the lights died, replacing a faulty sensor in the climate control system. And his first thought wasn't about the building's backup generators or the emergency protocols that would kick in automatically. His first thought was about Isla, who'd been working late again, who was probably somewhere in the executive offices wondering if the darkness was just another thing she'd have to fix alone. The emergency lighting cast everything in harsh red shadows as Daniel made his way through the stairwell, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness that seemed thicker than it should have been. The backup generators had started, but only essential systems were running. Lights in stairwells and exits, elevators shut down, heating systems cycling to minimum operation. It would be cold by morning if he couldn't get the main power restored. He found the problem in the electrical room on the 40th floor, a relay that had finally given up after 15 years of faithful service, taking down 3 distribution panels with it when it died. Daniel had replacement parts in his truck, but getting to them meant navigating 40 floors of darkened building and then carrying equipment back up by hand. He was halfway down the stairwell when he heard footsteps above him, the distinctive click of heels on concrete that could only belong to one person. Isla was making her way down from the executive floors, moving carefully but steadily through the emergency lighting. "Daniel?" her voice echoed in the stairwell. "Right here," he called back. "Power should be restored within 2 hours." "I wasn't worried about the power," she said, and something in her tone made him stop walking. She was 3 flights above him, leaning over the railing to see his flashlight beam. In the red emergency lighting, she looked like someone from a different world, all shadows and sharp angles and eyes that reflected light like water. "I was worried about you," she said. "Miguel said you were working late, and when the power went out—" Daniel climbed the stairs until he was on the same landing, close enough to see that she'd been genuinely frightened, not about the building or the power grid or the inconvenience of working in the dark, but about him. "I'm fine," he said. "This kind of thing happens, usually when it's coldest outside and most inconvenient for everyone involved." "Murphy's Law?" "Something like that." She nodded, but didn't move to continue down the stairs. In the narrow space of the landing, with emergency lights casting red shadows on concrete walls, they were closer than they'd ever been. Close enough that Daniel could smell her perfume, could see the way she was holding her purse against her side like armor. "I should let you get back to work," she said, but she didn't move. "Isla," Daniel said quietly, "what's wrong?" She laughed, but it came out shaky. "Besides the fact that I'm standing in a dark stairwell in a building that's supposed to be impossible to shut down. Besides that." She was quiet for a moment, and Daniel could hear the building settling around them, the distant hum of emergency systems keeping essential functions alive. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about what you said. About learning to ask for things I need instead of just providing things other people need. And I don't know how to do that without feeling like I'm falling apart." Daniel shifted his weight, and the movement caused his flashlight beam to sweep across his tool bag. In the quick flash of light, something caught Isla's attention. A piece of paper sticking out from between his tools, faded crayon lines visible at the edge. "Is that?" She reached toward it without thinking. Daniel followed her gaze and felt his heart stop. The drawing had come loose from where he'd tucked it into his toolkit, Emma's crayon angel partially visible in the harsh white light. Isla's fingers froze halfway to the paper. Daniel. Ela. It's the same drawing. Her voice was strange, distant, like someone recognizing their own reflection after years of looking at photographs. The one from your workshop. But why would you? She looked at him sharply, and Daniel could see the exact moment when memory and recognition collided. Her face went very still, very pale, like someone who'd just realized they'd been walking on thin ice without knowing it. You carry it with you, she said. I keep it close, Daniel said carefully. Why would you keep a drawing from someone you rescued 11 years ago close enough to carry in your work bag? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Daniel wasn't sure either of them was ready for. But the emergency lighting was harsh and unforgiving, and there was nowhere to hide from the truth that had been building between them for weeks. Because, Daniel said slowly, I've been carrying it for 11 years, and in all that time I never stopped hoping I'd see you again. Isla's breath caught. What? Not because I expected anything, or because I thought you'd remember me, but because you were the last person who made me believe that what I did mattered. And when everything else fell apart, when Sarah died, when I left the fire department, when I didn't know how to be a father or how to fix anything important, that drawing reminded me that I'd done something right at least once. Daniel. And then you showed up in the executive lounge, writing postcards to a dead mother for a little brother who needed to believe in impossible things, and I knew. Before you told me your name, before I remembered the fire, I knew you were someone worth staying for. Isla pulled the drawing fully free from his tool bag, holding it in the flashlight beam like evidence of something she couldn't quite name. The crayon lines were faded but still clear, the careful handwriting of a 5-year-old who'd decided that firefighters and angels were the same thing. I drew this for you, she said. You drew this for Angel Daniel, Daniel corrected gently. I just happened to be the person who was there. No, Isla said firmly. I drew this for the man who didn't just carry me to safety. I drew this for the person who made me feel like I was worth saving. She looked up at him, and in the red emergency lighting, her eyes looked silver and bright and full of something that might have been recognition, or might have been hope. You came back, she whispered. I never left, Daniel said. I've been right here, fixing things that were broken, waiting for someone to come back for what they'd left behind. And you think I left something behind? I think we both did. The silence that followed was different from any silence they'd shared before. It was full of weight and possibility and the strange mathematics of memory and time that had brought them back together in a dark stairwell, holding a faded drawing between them like proof that some things were worth waiting for. Daniel, Isla said. Yeah? I'm still scared. Of what? Of needing someone. Of letting someone matter enough that losing them would break me all over again. Daniel reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and covered her hand where it held the drawing. Being scared doesn't mean you're not brave. It just means you have something worth protecting. What if I don't know how to let someone stay? Then maybe we figure it out together, Daniel said. Maybe we learn how to build something that doesn't break when the power goes out. Above them, the building settled deeper into darkness, but the emergency systems hummed steadily, keeping essential things alive. And in a stairwell between floors, two people who had spent years learning to carry everything alone began to understand that some lights were worth keeping burning, even in the darkest places. That year, Isla's apartment was nothing like Daniel had expected. He'd imagined something sleek and minimalist. All white surfaces and expensive art, the kind of space that looked like it belonged in a magazine rather than a life. Instead, he found himself in a place that felt like a home that had been trying very hard to be a sanctuary. The living room was warm with mismatched furniture that looked chosen for comfort rather than style. A deep blue couch covered with throw pillows, bookshelves that sagged under the weight of novels and art books and children's stories, a coffee table scarred by years of homework and art projects. The walls were covered with Ethan's drawings, dozens of them, a gallery of angels and buildings and faces that looked happy. It's not what you expected, Isla said, watching Daniel take in the space. It's better, he said honestly. It looks like people actually live here. Ethan appeared from what Daniel assumed was his bedroom, carrying a sketchbook and wearing pajamas covered with cartoon rockets. He'd been working on a new drawing, something with more detail than his usual angels, a cityscape with buildings that reached toward a sky full of stars. "Daniel!" Ethan's face lit up with the kind of pure joy that belonged to children who hadn't learned yet that adults were complicated. "Did you come to see my room? I have new drawings." "I'd love to see them," Daniel said, and meant it. Ethan's room was exactly what 8-year-old creativity looked like when it had space to spread. Walls covered with artwork, a desk that was more art supply storage than workspace, and a bulletin board where he'd pinned his favorite pieces. But what caught Daniel's attention was the corner where Ethan's bed sat beneath a window that looked out over the city. The desk there had a loose hinge on one of its drawers, the kind of thing that would get worse over time if nobody fixed it. Daniel could see where Ethan had been trying to work around it, stacking books to keep the drawer closed, using tape to hold the handle in place. "This giving you trouble?" Daniel asked, crouching down to examine the hinge. "It's okay," Ethan said quickly. "I can work around it." But Daniel was already pulling a small screwdriver from his pocket. He'd learned to carry basic tools everywhere after Emma had started pointing out every loose screw and wobbly chair leg in their apartment. "Let me just tighten this up for you." Isla appeared in the doorway as Daniel worked, leaning against the frame with an expression that was part gratitude and part something else. Surprise, maybe, at seeing someone fix something without being asked, without making it into a big production or a favor that would need to be repaid. "There you go," Daniel said, testing the drawer. It slid smoothly now, no sticking, no need for books or tape. "Should work better now." "Thanks," Ethan said. But he was looking at Daniel with something that went beyond gratitude. Like someone who'd just realized that problems could be solved simply, without drama or delay. "Can I show you something?" Ethan asked, pulling open the newly fixed drawer. Inside, nestled among art supplies and half-finished drawings, was a small collection of postcards. Not the ones Isla had been writing. These were different, older, with child-friendly pictures of animals and cartoon characters. "These are from before," Ethan said quietly. "From when Mom used to travel for work, she'd always send me postcards from her business trips." Daniel picked up one of the cards, noting the careful handwriting that belonged to someone who loved the person she was writing to. The message was simple. "Missing you, sweetheart. See you soon. Love, Mom." But it was real in a way that made his chest tight. "She stopped traveling when I was 6, Ethan continued. "Got sick and had to stay home, but Isla kept the postcards coming." Daniel looked at Isla, who was watching her brother with an expression of fierce protectiveness mixed with exhaustion. "Ethan." "I know they're not really from Mom," Ethan said matter-of-factly. "I figured it out last year. Mom's handwriting was different, and the stamps weren't right. And also—" He hesitated, then looked directly at his sister. "Also, Isla always gets really sad after she mails them." The silence that followed was the kind that changed everything just by existing. Daniel could see Isla's careful composure cracking, could see the exact moment when she realized that her protection had become transparent. "You knew?" she whispered. "I've known for a while," Ethan said gently, "but I didn't want you to stop because I thought you needed to write them. Like how I need to draw angels even when I'm not sad." Isla sat down heavily on Ethan's bed, like her legs had forgotten how to hold her weight. "I was trying to protect you." "I know," Ethan said, climbing up next to her. "And it worked. It helped. But now I'm older, and I think maybe we could miss Mom together instead of you missing her by yourself." Daniel watched this exchange from across the room, struck by the wisdom that children developed when they grew up too fast, when they learned to read the emotional weather of the adults who were supposed to be taking care of them. Ethan wasn't angry about the deception. He was worried about his sister carrying too much alone. "What if I don't know how to miss her with someone else?" Isla asked, her voice small. "Then maybe we figure it out together," Ethan said, echoing words Daniel had spoken in a dark stairwell. "Maybe we learn how to be sad without being alone." Isla pulled her brother into a hug that looked like it was holding them both together, and Daniel understood that he was witnessing something private and precious, the moment when protection stopped being about lies and started being about truth shared between people who loved each other enough to carry it together. "I'm sorry," Isla said into Ethan's hair. "I'm sorry I tried to handle everything by myself." "It's okay," Ethan said, "but maybe next time you could ask for help? Like how Daniel fixed my desk without me having to figure out how to do it myself." Isla looked at Daniel over Ethan's head, and her expression was grateful and vulnerable and something else. Hopeful, maybe, like someone who just realized that asking for help didn't mean admitting defeat. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" she asked. "It's nothing fancy, just pasta and whatever vegetables I can convince Ethan are worth eating." "I'd like that," Daniel said, "but I should call Emma, let her know I'll be late." "Bring her over," Ethan said immediately. "She can see my new drawings, and we can show her how to make the buildings look three-dimensional." "It's a school night," Daniel said automatically. "So is tomorrow," Isla said with a small smile, "but sometimes school nights are for learning that families can be bigger than you thought they were." Daniel looked around Ethan's room, at the carefully organized art supplies, at the postcards from a mother who wasn't coming back, at the drawing wall that testified to a child's faith in angels and protection, and the belief that good things were possible if you just knew how to see them. "Okay," he said, "but Emma's bringing her portfolio. She's been working on something special for Ethan." "What kind of special?" Ethan asked, his eyes lighting up with the anticipation that belonged to children who understood that art was how people gave each other pieces of their hearts. "You'll see," Daniel said, pulling out his phone to call his daughter. "But I think you're going to like it." As he dialed Emma's number, Daniel caught Isla watching him with an expression he'd never seen before. Not careful or guarded or precisely controlled, but open. Like someone who'd spent years learning to carry everything alone and was just beginning to understand that some weights were lighter when they were shared. Outside Ethan's window, the city spread out like a promise of infinite possibility, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt like maybe they were all exactly where they were supposed to be. Christmas Eve arrived with snow that fell like benediction, soft and deliberate, transforming the city into something sacred. Daniel and Miguel had worked through the afternoon, converting the executive lounge into something that belonged more in dreams than corporate buildings. They'd arranged the desk lamps in careful spirals, their light warm against the windows. Paper snowflakes that Emma and Ethan had cut together hung from the ceiling, casting intricate shadows that danced with the wind. Polished metal surfaces caught the glow and multiplied it, creating a constellation that reached toward the storm outside. When Isla and Ethan arrived, the boy stopped in the doorway like he'd walked into wonder itself. "It's a tree made of lights," he whispered. Daniel stepped forward, carrying a small wrapped box. Inside was a frame containing sheet music, Margaret's favorite lullaby, copied in her handwriting from an old book Isla had saved. He'd found it among her things, knowing somehow that this was what Ethan needed most. "This is from your mom," Daniel said simply. "So you'll always remember how much she loved you." Ethan held the frame like it contained starlight. Then Emma appeared with her portfolio, and the children settled by the windows to compare their latest angels, while the adults watched snow erase the sharp edges of the world below. Isla's hand found Daniel's in the reflected glow of their improvised constellation. No words needed, just the quiet recognition that some things were worth waiting 11 years to find again. Outside, the city breathed with winter's rhythm, and inside, 4 people who had learned to survive alone discovered they no longer had to. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.